Have you ever looked at an animal and thought, okay, I don't like you. I don't want you near me, and I'm not even entirely sure what you are. That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the Northwoods, helping you be a neighborhood naturalist right outside your front door. Well, that's what we get when we're looking at what we call the Virginia possum. It kind of has filthy teeth. Its tail is naked and sort of scaly. It hisses, it drools, and if it's startled, it will literally pass out and smell like death. And it might be one of the most valuable animals you have in your backyard. Boy, I think that's what we have to do, is slow down and pay attention to the natural world right outside our front door. And today I'm going to make the case for the possum. And by the end of the episode, you might actually be very glad they're out there. This is the funny thing. I asked the question because you see it written and it has an O in front of it, opossum, but you don't pronounce the O. The Americans dropped the O when speaking. And even wildlife experts will say, written, it's opossum, spoken, it's possum. That's so confusing. The animal in the United States and Canada is the Virginia opossum. Possum, not opossum. And there is a real animal called possums, and they're in Australia and nearby regions, and they're known as the common brush-tailed possum. They are a related marsupial, but they're a whole different animal. The idea is that this word possum comes from the Algonquin language and was recorded by English colonists as early as 1600. The silent O survived in the spelling, but largely disappeared in everyday speech. So when we say possum, we actually mean it with the O in front of it, but we're not saying it. So that, just in case you wondered about that, I didn't know this. But essentially, both are considered to be okay in normal conversation. So let's just begin with, what is a possum? The Virginia possum is a marsupial that's native to North America, north of Mexico. And it's the only marsupial. So most of us, when we think of marsupials, we think of Australia, kangaroos, koalas, wombats. Right here in the Northwoods is a waddling marsupial going through leaf litter at night. We have our very own pouched mammal. And the ones we have probably migrated up through South America at some point, and they've been here a very long time. Physically, they look a little bit like you couldn't decide what you were building. It sort of has round ears of a cat, long pointed snout, long, round, naked ears, and white-faced with a gray body, and its tail is long, hairless, and scaly, and it's prehensile, which means that it can actually grip things with it. And their back feet have thumbs with opposable toes, which makes them excellent climbers. And then they have these teeth, 50 of them, and that's more than almost any other North American mammal. They look alarming, and it's kind of amazing. And if you, here in the Northwoods, you find them throughout this entire area. They're mostly active at night. They move through the woodland edges and creek corridors and suburban neighborhoods where garbage cans can be unlatched and get in. I have them in my backyard. I have a bunch of Eufy cameras. Some of it's for security, but I have to admit to you, some of it is so that I can see what is crawling through my backyard at night. And I have 2 cats. I have a fox, a coyote, a bunch of raccoons, and 1 possum family. And it's so cool because at first I was like, what is that? And now I'm thinking they're just probably the coolest thing out there. They don't hibernate, but they do slow down in winter. And in fact, they're not really very well built or designed for the cold. Their ears and tail tips are prone to frostbite because they at one point came from tropical roots. And they've just been pushing northward every, few years and eventually got to the Northwoods. So finding a tropical creature in the Northwoods is amazing, but January here is a tough life for a possum. So a few days ago, a friend of mine shared a picture of a skeleton, and everyone was trying to figure out what it was. It was nearly intact, laid out on the ground, and essentially the skull, it was intact. It had long, narrow snout and snout, and then the 50 teeth still present and accounted for. The partially decomposed was unmistakable. Took a picture of it. I shared it with AI just to make sure that I was correct in what it was, and it was a possum. The darkened tissue had been suggested that it had been there for several months, and it was decomposing slowly in this particular area. It was a quiet end for a really quiet animal. And I thought about it, when my friend shared this picture with me, that this creature spends its whole short life doing something that most of us never think about. It cleans up. It controls pests. It eats things that nobody else wants to eat. And then it returns to the forest floor. It spent its entire life walking. There's something just fitting about it. And let's just talk about what it actually does when it's alive. Possums are omnivores and scavengers. They eat almost anything. Insects, worms, frogs, snakes, bird eggs, small rodents, berries, acorns, any kind of meat, garbage, pet food left on a porch. They're not really picky about it. They will make them, they'll eat anything, and that makes them one of nature's most effective cleanup crew. By eating carrion and dead animals, they've reduced the spread of disease in the ecosystem. And by eating insects, including cockroaches, beetles, slugs, and the most important thing is they eat ticks. And ticks is what gives tick diseases. And I'm petrified of ticks, and they are one of the things that eats ticks. So I love them dearly for that. But by doing this pest control, they are reducing the number of pests out there. And by eating small rodents, they keep those populations in check. And those possums moving through our yards at night. And so here's the part you probably want to remember. And like I mentioned a moment ago, because they eat ticks, there were researchers at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies that spent years studying which animal in the forest systems were effective at killing ticks, specifically the black-legged ticks that spread Lyme disease. They put different species in enclosures, covered them up with areas with ticks, and counted then how many of the ticks survived. The white-footed mouse, which are abundant in eastern forest, are a major reservoir for Lyme disease bacteria, essentially hosting a large number of ticks with little problem. Same thing with chipmunks, shrews, similar story, but the possums were different. The possum is an extraordinary groomer. And as the ticks find their way to their fur, they end up eating the ticks, and it becomes a feeding site for them. The possums catch and eat the ticks. And the researchers found that the possums killed approximately 96% of the ticks that land on them. This senior researcher at the Carey Institute described them as walking through the forest floor and hoovering up ticks left and right. A single possum may kill thousands of ticks per week. And over a season, they estimated it can run up as high as 5,000 ticks per possum. And so if you think about that a moment, every possum is in your local woods acting as a tick vacuum cleaner. And that's because their immune system is effective at resisting Lyme disease. The ticks that do survive on them don't carry the pathogen. The possums don't carry the pathogens. And so what researchers found is they call it a dilution host, meaning that they absorb the tick's exposure in a way that reduces the disease overall in the ecosystem. So if you live over here in the Northwoods, place where we have what's called deer ticks, that includes most of the state, the possum in your neighborhood is doing something for your health that no spray, no barrier, no other critter out there can do. And it usually doesn't get very much credit for it. So let's talk a little bit why people don't like them. And I think it's because that possums are misunderstood based on their behavior. They drool. They like to hiss when they're under a certain threat. And when a possum feels cornered or threatened, it opens up its mouth up widely and shows all its teeth and then begins to drool. It looks aggressive, but it isn't. It is bluffing. Possums are actually quite docile animals. They're just trying to look scarier because they know they can't run away very fast. And so they're just trying to scare you off. But the display is an equivalent of a very small person trying to look large. You ever see like one of those little dogs that thinks it's a big dog, and trying to scare you away? But then comes the interesting behavior of playing possum. And this is one of the most famous possum behaviors. And there's all sorts of YouTube videos out there, and they're kind of funny. But it's genuinely strange that when a possum feels that a threat is very severe or they're just overwhelmed, the possum will suddenly collapse and go rigid. And its eyes get glassy and its mouth hangs open and its breathing dramatically slows. And it releases a foul-smelling greenish fluid from its rear that smells. And it's supposed to smell like it's dead and rotting already. The remarkable part is that the scientists believe it's involuntary, that the possum doesn't choose to play dead. It's something in their nervous system that creates this catatonic state in extreme moments of stress. And so the brain activity in the recording shows that the animal is actually at a highly alerted state, but the rest of the world looks at it and is convinced it's dead. So most predators avoid eating it, and, because most predators don't eat carrion, that's like things like vultures and those types of birds. So they leave it alone. So the possum will remain in this state from anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, then quietly recover and then walk away. Its defense mechanism is born out of necessity because they don't really have a lot of options. They're slow, they're not fighters, they can climb but not very quickly, and so they can't escape most threats. So they are now doing this involuntary response, and it works. Here's where the thing that's kind of comes in interesting is people get concerned about rabies, and this comes up a lot in articles when you read articles about it. Possums are extraordinarily resistant to rabies. Doesn't mean they can't get it, but their body temperatures run lower than most mammals, making it very difficult for the rabies virus to establish itself. So the possum drooling and hissing and looking erratic is most likely not rabid. This is normal possum behavior when it's frightened. The rabies risk from possum is considerably low. It has snake venom resistance. And one of the most unusual facts, is that the possums have a unique protein in their blood that neutralizes venom of pit vipers, rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths, and they can eat these snakes with a minimal risk to themselves. Researchers are actually studying these proteins to see if there's some sort of a medical application to treating snake bites from the possums. There's something about the possum's lifespan that I wanted to talk about is I think that it matters how we see them. If we look at in the wild and we see a Virginia possum that lives maybe 1.5, maybe 2 years, that's it. Even in captivity, regular food and no predators, they rarely make it past 4. An animal of that size, that's usually of a house cat, that's pretty short life. The biologists have a theory about it, and that's because the possums have very few defenses against predators, frequently are killed when they're young, and they have never been under any sort of a selective pressure to develop cellular repair mechanisms that will enable the animal to live longer. There's no sort of benefit to the animal living longer if you're just going to become somebody's dinner. And so they live fast, they reproduce prolifically, and then they die young. A female can have 2 litters per year of 6 to 9 young, sometimes maybe even a little bit more. And the babies are born only about 13 days after gestation. We're 9 months, they're 13 days. And they're tiny, undeveloped, they're the size of honeybees at birth. And they immediately crawl into their mother's pouch, where they spend about 2 months developing. Then eventually they ride on her back for another month. And then somewhere around 5 months old, they're on their own. And the system works because, again, like I said, each individual possum doesn't live very long, but the population is constantly replenishing itself. It's a strategy for building basically a high mortality, rapidly replaced creatures. And so, I've been thinking about that. I remember at my work one day, my HR director came out and she said, "Did you see what's crawling through the backyard of our office?" And I looked out there and it was a possum that had a bunch of babies just clinging onto the outer edge. And it was like a clown car of little baby possums. So essentially, it was just a funny thing to see. But now it brings it back to that picture that someone showed me of the dead possum in the woods. It probably wasn't very old when it died. And it probably spent its whole life eating ticks, cleaning up carrion, and moving quietly through the dark. It's not a glamorous life, but it's certainly a very useful one. And I don't know, I'm so appreciative of what they do. So my plea on behalf of the possums out there is they're not trying to hurt you. They're not aggressive. They're not rabid, probably. They're not a cause for problems. They're just doing a job. They're eating ticks, consuming carrion, cleaning out the pests, and moving on. They're solitary, nomadic animals with no permanent territory. They just move through the night looking for their next meal. And so the thing that makes people dislike them, the teeth, the tail, the hissing, the drooling, the playing dead, it's just defense mechanisms for an animal that has no other way to fight. It knows it's small and it's vulnerable and slow, so it's not threatening you. It's just trying to frighten you. And so if you have opossums in your yard, you have a free, natural tick control system working on the night shift, cleaning out your backyard. You have a scavenger cleaning up things you didn't even notice needed cleaning up. You have a piece of lineage of an animal whose ancestors walked North America when it was a very different place. And so the next time when you see one frozen in your headlight or discover one under your porch or find evidence of one in your leaf litter, I hope that you think of this episode and you think, there goes the tick vacuum. There goes the North American only marsupial. There goes a creature that nobody loves, but is doing the work anyway. And that's, I think, something worth respecting. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Appreciate you being out there. This is Jill from the Northwoods and big possum fan. I find that all my shows, sort of start with something that kind of grabbed my attention. And so I hope it helps you kind of pay attention to something maybe you never focused on before. That's the whole point. Share it with someone who maybe needs to have their minds changed about possums. All right, we'll see you on the trail.